The Open Therapy Institute is addressing bias in mental health care. Go to our website, opentherapyinstitute.org. We have CE credit workshops about overlooked issues in the field. You can go to our workshop page and register now and become a member. And for those looking for a therapist, we match people with someone who's highly skilled and truly open. Just contact us through the contact page on the website or email us at info@opentherapyinstitute.org. Hi, I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce from the Radical Center.
I'm Andrew Hartz from the Open Therapy Institute.
We were just talking about something that I've found really fascinating over the last, I don't know, several years or this recent period of cultural upheaval. And that's you hear the phrase weaponization of empathy quite a bit, and these ideas about people having too much empathy, too overrun with compassion, and that this is sort of the source of a lot of our problems. I don't tend to think of it that way, though. I think that it's misdirected or strangely targeted, focused empathy, because sometimes when we see this over direction of empathy towards a particular source, it's accompanied by a dearth of empathy for other people who are in the same situation or are sidelined in that particular situation. And I guess it would help to be a little bit more specific. But one example that I can think of that comes to my mind is the trans debate, the gender debate. So we seem to have different schemas on two different sides of that discussion. So some people, when they're picturing the trans person, they're thinking of a person that they have a lot of sympathy for. This is the target of their empathy. This is a person who has trouble fitting in, has this deep discomfort with their own body, who has been sidelined and marginalized by society, who is just trying to be okay with themselves, and they need care. They need special attention and medical treatment, psychological treatment, and social support in order to just be okay. So this is the target, the sort of schema that this one side will have. Whereas the other side that you hear, if you can picture it in two sides, will be about giving the empathy to, say, women who are being displaced in sports and in their own dressing rooms. And we'll look at the fact that now we'll often see a men's restroom and a gender neutral restroom. So it's this displacement of women. So the woman becomes the target of empathy. And the schema for the trans person is more predatory, more dangerous. But we're looking at the same individual or the same topic in our mind, and we've developed a different set of automatic assumptions. And so I find this very interesting, and I think of it as kind of a schema mismatch, really. And I wonder, is that just because we are trying too broadly to use heuristics when we think about people? We're trying to it's sort of this atomized and yet very diffuse population trying to argue over situations that happen on the personal level but appear in our imagination in this particular way. We have to make a picture in our mind about it. So anyway, I wonder what are your thoughts
I
on this kind
tot
of issue?
I was so interested when I heard you first mention this because this is something that I've been thinking about a lot as well. And I think I I think that there's kind of like what it's a monstrous kind of empathy that's emerging. I think it's definitely related to identity politics, ways of thinking, but typically there's one group that gets this kind of limitless empathy that I do think is kind of a horrifying limitless empathy.
Mm.
And then there are these other groups, and it's often not even acknowledged that this is going on, but then there are these other groups that get this equally horrifying total lack of empathy. So the excessive empathy, you can see this when it's like somebody who committed a violent crime needs empathy. Um, and I remember there was somebody I was talking to was a psychologist, and he was talking about somebody who mugged an old lady and took her purse. But he was black. The assailant was black, and he believed that this was just an outcome of systemic racism. And
Mm-hmm.
so he thought that this person who was this attacker deserved all of this empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And there was almost this sense of like, um, if you can really empathize with people, even when they're attacking an old lady, there's something really terrifying about that kind of empathy. And another example might be like terrorists who like are deliberately targeting, murdering, torturing,
Mm-hmm.
kidnapping civilians, and they get empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something really horrifying about boundless empathy for certain groups, that it really easily slips into a rationale for crime or even war crimes, or like there's something very terrifying
Mm-hmm.
about that empathy. And there's this other, I think it's usually not acknowledged, total lack of empathy for the victims, total lack of empathy for the people that are excluded. So you get some of this, maybe, I think this is pervades identity politics, where there's certain groups where if you use the wrong word once, that's a microaggression that creates this trauma. Um, and for some groups, and then for the other groups, even if you directly insult them for their who they are, that's fine. That's just
Mm-hmm.
justice, and I saw this all the time, like playing out in reality when I was in grad school in particular, where there'd be somebody who would freak out about the misuse of one word, like it's Latinx, not Latinx or something, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like that's the greatest insult. And then they would just say in class, white people are stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody who just has no empathy for one group, no matter how obviously directly hateful and bigoted the comments are. And then for this other group, there's this like so much empathy that even the most well-intentioned slight word thing that's small, is worth it's this incredible affront. And there is
Mm-hmm.
this kind of, I think it does have this split to it. It has this
Mm-hmm.
all or nothing quality to it, where certain groups get endless empathy and others get none. But it ends up being, I think when we encounter it, it does end up being horrifying,
Mm-hmm.
and a rationalization for real extreme aggression.
You
And
know,
yeah,
what's interesting is like the example that you gave of the guy who steals the old woman's bag. It it is what's horrifying about that is if you can apply the empathy to his situation, and it's like a switch where you've now cut off empathy for the other individual. I think empathy, even in that situation, might make some sense to because a lack of empathy, a lack of being able to understand how someone came to do the thing that they came to do, on some level
yeah,
seems like a denial of human nature. And if we're to really understand how we can not repeat those same patterns or not end up in a particular situation, it does make sense that you would try to understand how someone came to do even the most heinous things. But what seems so shocking to me is this sort of cutoff that happens, almost like it's a switch being flipped. Like here, and I'm going to go back to gender because this is one of the places where I keep on seeing this. This is
right.
when I was in graduate school and I was taking a human sexuality class for counselors. We had to watch a film about how trans people have always been here. It was this very like sympathetic to trans identified people, trans children in particular. We had to, see that and there was never the question raised like, are they really trans children or are they children with gender dysphoria and trans is one particular way that we could interpret that or go with that. But one of the discussions that came up afterwards, and we were all asked to take part in, was around people who are trans identified who experience partner rejection. So a man who decides to come out to his wife that he's trans and she divorces him or doesn't love him anymore or won't engage with him in a sexual way anymore, or a trans woman who goes out on a date and then after the date, if they end up having intimate relations, this person is rejected by the partner upon finding out that the person is trans. And what we were asked to do as counseling trainees was to empathize solely with the rejected individual in these scenarios.
Right,
And we
right,
were we were told to focus, and this is where the discussion focused on the pain of that rejection. And what I thought was, yeah, I can see how that would be painful. I can
right,
perform the um, the mental imagery to get into that person's scenario and see that they would feel vulnerable, exposed, rejected, and hurt. But even more than that, I can empathize with the other person in that picture who feels like
right.
they have been tricked, who feels like
Yes,
they have had uh, something they feel betrayed because something that was important to them was withheld from them and then sprung on them in a way that changed their entire understanding of the situation that they were in. And there was no empathy given in this particular discussion that was led by the professor to that person's experience. And in my perception, I perceived them as more of the victim, just like I perceived the woman who got her handbag stolen as far more of a victim than whatever it was in the assailant's life that led him to
right.
make such choices and involve himself in criminal behavior.
Totally. Well, and it's also, I think, related to it, there is this kind of idealization of the group that warrants empathy. You know, empathy means it's really about sharing feeling with somebody.
Mhm,
It's about connecting at an emotional level to what that person is really feeling
mhm,
and really connecting to their state. And if it's accurate, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean it's different from idealizing someone.
mhm,
You know, saying, "Oh, you did everything perfectly. Everything bad that happens was always the result of other people because you're perfect."
mhm.
That's usually not empathic because that's usually not true. So maybe it's never true, you
Yeah.
know? So it's like the idea that like maybe this person who mugged this old lady and took her purse was a psychopath,
Mhm,
you know, and he is blaming systemic racism because he doesn't have capacity for remorse or because he likes manipulating this therapist he sees as dumb and he
mhm,
likes pulling one over on him. Um, you know, actually reading that accurately, as this is somebody who's got a lot of aggression, maybe somebody who enjoys lying and manipulating, maybe is psychopathic, recognizing that is more empathic
mhm,
than tuning that out and idealizing this person as somebody they're not.
mhm,
And, you know, when you're talking about the trans thing, I mean, I don't think it's all trans people, obviously, but there are trans people who get off on tricking
mhm,
others and they like tricking and they want to fool you. And that's, you know, maybe even part of the fetish. I mean, so it's like to ignore that that might be part of what's attracting them to this isn't empathic. To ignore the aggression, like that the terrorist, maybe the terrorist who's maybe they're not hapless victims who have tried every means they can think of and have been driven to terrorism, you know, against their will, and they're pure-hearted. You know, maybe that's not accurate. Maybe they're really, really hateful fanatics who are full of aggression and want to hurt others
mhm,
out of malice, which is probably more often the case.
mhm,
And so it's like, but it's not realistic. And so there is this weird thing where it's like, it's not just the all or nothing thing, but it's also like, it's not grounded empathy in the reality of, is that what really happened? Or
Hmm.
are you just telling yourself this fantasy of the trans person on the date is this perfect, well-meaning person who's done everything they can think of to do things right, and the person rejecting them is just this cruel, soulless, mean, transphobic,
Hmm.
awful person? Like, that's probably not what happened. That probably doesn't happen that much.
Hmm.
It's people are more complicated than that all or nothing framing. Um, and I think, and I guess the other thing I'll say is like I also think like with identity politics, it necessitates these types of dysfunctional ways of thinking because as
Hmm.
soon as you say these are the groups I care about, you're you're implicitly saying these are the groups I don't care about. And once you start doing that, it really has a tendency to spiral to where the groups you don't care about are really getting ignored and isolated and
Hmm.
discarded, and the groups you do care about get idealized, and you know so it's really I really noticed this trend as a result of like the intensification of identity politics over the past decade.
Hmm. And when you point to that idealization, I'm brought back to the conversation we had around splitting and the
Yeah.
primitive defense mechanism of idealizing and devaluing, and what that that really explains a lot of, or is one way to look at a lot of this behavior. It's like if you are in the targeted group that is chosen for empathy, then you really can do no wrong. And whatever you do that is wrong is going to be assimilated into the existing schema that we have for you. And it's going to be explained away as not your fault. And at the other side, there's no potential for empathy for that side. And I think that that's a really scary trend.
Oh, it's totally horrifying. And I think in reality, like when I see this kind of like monstrous empathy, this distorted empathy, there's a ton of aggression in it.
Mhm.
It really is terrifying. It can be an incredibly it's just so misattuned, and there's so much and disowned aggression that's embedded in this kind of like weird empathy that's not connected to reality. Um, and it's a shame that it's linked to empathy because I do agree with what you're saying, which is like if empathy is accurate and reality based and balanced, it's a powerful tool to understand people better. Empathy should be a way of more accurately understanding the world.
Mhm.
It's a way to actually have a better insight into what people are doing and why.
Mhm.
And so it's getting a bad name because it's linked to these really dysfunctional behaviors, which I think is a loss because it can be it's a really powerful tool if it's used correctly.
Mhm.
Um,
I don't know if you'd be interested in commenting on this, but I find it interesting some of the dialogue around misplaced, or I love how you call it monstrous empathy, because that's a really good phrase for what we're seeing. I think it captures a lot of what the gravity of this misdirection is. Um,
yeah.
but for instance, Jordan Peterson is commonly quoted as applying this to an over representation of women in our bureaucratic power structure. And I think that that's very interesting. I don't know what I think about that. I think that he's kind of implying that it's it's a problem that is sort of inevitable when you have more women running the show. And I'm not sure I agree with that, because I can see the point. I'm interested in hearing more opinions on this, but I don't think that women necessarily have to perform that split. I think while there could be more empathy, was it inevitable that it would be monstrous empathy that comes with that splitting, that idealization, devaluation?
That's interesting. I haven't thought as much about it. I do think I mean, we're kind of being forced to kind of like talk about gender stereotypes and like patterns that like
Yeah.
obviously there's an immense variability in men and women in terms of their thoughts and impact empathy and stuff. But I do think that when men get together and create an institution, um, the conversations start with like, what are the rules?
Hmm.
And so you're starting to think at the beginning about what are the what abstract principles and what are the penalties for violating them.
Hmm.
And it does make it harder to get these systems that are really out of whack, where it's kind of like, wait, you're going to have empathy for this one party, but not this other one?
Hmm.
On what basis?
Hmm.
You know, that in that at the larger scale, now maybe that in a family or in like a couple or something like that, where that's not that's probably not how you want your marriage to look.
Hmm.
Like these are the rules, and if you
Hmm.
violate the penalties, then you don't want to be in that marriage or family,
Right.
probably. You want things to be more based on like, looser and more based on attunement. But I think at the larger and larger scale, it doesn't work and it starts to go haywire.
Hmm.
Um, and um, I wonder if that might be the difference, that there's these kinds of like interpersonal models that work
Hmm.
at a certain scale and might be superior at a smaller scale when they're kind of scaled up. Like if Twitter is trying to run its content moderation policy based on some kind of like empathy thing, as opposed to like clear rules, I think that makes it really susceptible to exploitation and dysfunction. Or like a government or something
Hmm.
or other organizations. So I wonder if it maybe has more to do with that as opposed to it is hard. I mean, I don't this is like a stereotype. I'm not sure how realistic it is, but it's kind of like the female voter, sees the sad immigrant child and she's just like, we've got to let him come in. And she doesn't think about like these are massive population changes that have an effect on the economy, and there's rules of law and systems that have to be like they're just like they
Hmm.
don't think that way. They're just thinking about this sad child with like dirt on his face who like looks hungry. And
Hmm.
like, and it's like there is something where that really presumably empathic reaction.
Hmm. So the
When you're thinking
marketing of
about
pathos, really.
yeah, or like it doesn't work when you're kind of like, yeah, we don't want to have a war, but like sometimes you do, and so you
Hmm.
fight it as ethically as you can, but that does mean you're killing people. Like we wish we could let all the sad children come in and feed them, but we can't. And like you
Hmm.
have to have systems with rules or they get exploited. We
Hmm.
don't want this person to have to go to jail, but like you need some system. And like this is the like it's like that type of stuff. Whereas if you want to carve out all these exceptions for the sad looking children, then it's like you all of a sudden you don't have a rule of law, you don't
Hmm.
have functioning systems, and they're really susceptible to these kinds of like empathic mood swings.
Hmm.
I'm not sure how if that I don't know what the evidence base looks like for it. I mean, that's definitely a stereotype that's out there, but
Yeah. Well, I think that you're bringing up something that I'm really glad you brought up, which is the scale issue. That's the thing that I keep coming back to. When you talk about the family can carve out all kinds of exceptions because they can
right.
know each other, and you can know so and so operates more like this. Here's his strengths, here's his
Yes.
challenges, and so we kind of accommodate him in these ways, and we kind of whatever. And each person is known to the whole, and we can operate in a way that meets everybody's needs. But if you scale out, you have these rigid systems that are operating in these robotic, technical, rules-based ways. And so if you start to look to carve out exceptions for those people, like you are going to be using a utilitarian framework, which means that some people are going to be left out of the exception that you're carving out, and some people are going to be unfairly rewarded, or even um, so one of the I think right away of COVID and the don't kill grandma. So the schema being the
Right.
vulnerable old person. But then what about all of the old people who said, no, I don't want to be isolated from my family, or they were on their deathbed and they were isolated on their deathbed, but they're still being
Right.
quote unquote protected by the
Oh,
system. And
yeah.
there's
Oh, and
a
the
rigid,
kids are being harmed. You
right,
know, it's
the
like
1 year old with a mask.
don't kill grandma, but you're going to wreck the mental health of the and education of
Yeah.
your children.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
totally. And there was a study. I'm not sure. I don't have a citation for it, but I remember being taught about it, and it said that it was about gender differences between men and women or sex differences between men and women about how they find their way with maps or how they find
Mm.
their way when they're lost and that like men focus on like cardinal directions
Hmm.
and like going like north, south, east, west to get where they need to go and women tend to think about positioning themselves around certain landmarks.
Landmarks.
Have you've heard this? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like a very similar thing where you can see how in a moral framework
Hmm.
you you do get certain people who kind of situate their morality around certain
Hmm.
landmarks
Hmm.
of like these figures who have to be protected,
Hmm.
for example, and they really lose track of like the large system. And like when you're navigating in a smaller area closer to home,
Hmm.
that landmark system can work pretty well, maybe even better, because you don't have to think about like where's the sun. You can just
Hmm.
like there's the landmark and you get there. And so it works there. But then when you're like going out over a longer distance, you actually really do need to have these maps that go
Hmm.
into more detail. But you can see it too with like a principle of like I think that seems like it's that's a very like male stereotype. It's like we've got to do this for the principle
Hmm.
of it, and the woman's like, whatever, I don't care, you know. But it might be so I don't know. I wouldn't want to speak too off the cuff about how much this is happening. I definitely know plenty of men who are really captive to really biased empathy to
Hmm.
me.
Hmm.
And this is, I'm thinking of other videos like not just the splitting one, but anti-white hate. Like,
Hmm.
why is it so forbidden to have empathy for victims of anti-white racial aggression? Why is that such a threat?
Hmm.
That's one of the most taboo topics in our entire society.
Hmm.
And I can't think of really any moral rationale for why that should be so forbidden.
Hmm.
But it really is. And and yet empathy for racial aggression towards other groups is like often seen as the most important
Hmm.
issue in our society. And I don't um but I don't know that I don't know how huge the gender difference is between like, hey, look, if you're against race hate for one, you should be against race hate for the other. That's the fair principle that we all play by the same fair rules versus somebody who's just kind of like, I saw a sad black child and that's
Hmm.
all I can hold my mind. And so I can't think
Hmm.
about the sad white child,
Hmm.
because that's too complicated for me or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. Well, thanks for being willing to at least touch on it because I think that there's a lot there. There's so much the war of the sexes is alive and raging and I think there's a lot to talk about within that.
Yeah,
So
excellent. Glad we
yeah.
did.
Well, thank you for this conversation about empathy. And do you think there's anything we missed that we should stress or go back and revisit?
Um, no, I mean, it's just, I mean, I guess going back to the splitting thing, if I
Hmm.
could just say this is
Hmm.
like why splitting is such an important concept is because it's not just really all or nothing thinking. I think it becomes clearer what it is when you think about something like empathy. Like it's all or
Hmm.
nothing empathy. It's all or nothing morality.
Yeah.
It's all or nothing relationship schemas.
Hmm.
One has all the power, the other doesn't. And it's something that's more, it structures thoughts and it structures behavior. rather than I think a lot of people when they hear splitting, they think somebody who's splitting literally goes out and says, I think this group is all good and this group is all bad. And people
Hmm.
almost never speak that way.
Hmm.
It's more just they only say good about one and they only say bad about the other, or they only express empathy towards one and they never express empathy towards the other. So I think you can hopefully this is helpful too for people to think about how splitting actually shapes people's thinking and how it actually manifests, which
Hmm.
is through like distorted empathy as like one example among many.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm reminded of relationships with where one intimate partner is someone who tends to engage in splitting, say a narcissistic partner. You'll see a lot of empathy and a lot of connection between the two partners when things are good. But then if the partner, if the, I guess the victim in this situation is to go against their partner, suddenly they're cast outside of the self bubble and they are other. And the attack can be really vicious. So you can have this real clear delineation from when you're with me and I love you and I have all empathy for you, and when you're against me and now you are anathema and I reject you with everything that I have. So that relational dynamic on the smaller scale too. I'm reminded of that as you're talking about the splitting
Yeah,
behavior.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Right. And it's like it's not like um it's more just how you feel it in the
Hmm.
relationship might be more the way that it manifests rather than them saying like yesterday I saw you as all good, now I see you
Yeah,
as all bad, which they're not going to say.
because people are rarely that
Don't say
self-aware.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Hmm. Well, excellent. Thank you so much for a good conversation.
Thanks, Leslie.